Great. So I'm a moral and political philosopher, which makes, I think, may be the only one, but what I hope to do is that I'm going to draw on relatively intuitive and interdisciplinary ideas around this issue. So I'll explain a bit about my issue. And in case it's relevant, I have sort of a medical background as well, and I've worked in sort of, a lot of these questions come from my interest in the civil service and around how we set priorities in global health interventions and other kinds of injustices more generally. So I actually think that a lot of these presentations normally start with, some statistics around global health, around what's happening, and they try and convince us that something is wrong or something is really bad, and they tell us why. But I actually think that these are not the most interesting questions. So often we have widespread agreement that something is really bad. So we all agree famine in a particular developing country is very bad. We agree that, a child drowning in a pond, to use Singer's example, is really bad. The kind of main controversy in political theory is who should act and who has the kind of moral responsibility to act. And this is known as the problem of remedial responsibility. So it's very common to say, yeah, that's bad, but it's not my responsibility. People say, yeah, that's bad, but what can I do about it? And often it's a challenge to articulate why it is that you or someone or a group of agents should be the one who is tasked with responding to that kind of injustice. And so this leads us to the view that it's one thing to agree that something is wrong, but it's totally different to agree on whom it falls to remedy a particular injustice. And what I want to do in this talk is to highlight this problem slightly to people who are outside the field of sort of moral and political philosophy, to evaluate some of the debates and to show why a sort of alternative view, what I'm proposing, is sort of the most plausible way to respond to this. And roughly the presentation will have 4 sections. So firstly, I want to motivate this case of remedial responsibility a tiny bit more. And I also want to actually focus a bit on why we should care about remedying global health. So I think especially in distributive justice debates around ethics, it's not always clear why global health or health is actually important. So I just want to say a bit about why we should care about that from a political theory perspective. I'm then going to evaluate the concept of remedial responsibility, and in particular, 6 reasons people think you can be the one in particular to remedy a particular problem. So if there's an issue that needs remedying, here are 6 principles people think that can motivate you morally to act, or to command you rather morally to act. And then I'm going to draw on an influential theory by David Miller around what's called the connection theory. I'm then going to show that a lot of these discussions are unsatisfactory, and I'm going to propose a kind of alternative framework called the dynamic capacity account, which will often have one of 2 responses. One response will be, well, that's really obvious. Why should we do that? And the other response is, well, that's just totally wrong. And why I think that those are quite telling reactions is I'm then going to hopefully address some objections. So people on either side can hopefully come to the middle and say that it has a role and it's relatively plausible, but it's not as obvious as it first appears, and it's not as implausible as it initially appears. So it's a kind of middle ground reasoning that will hopefully arrive at. And as I said, I will try and sort of not assume prior knowledge of sort of moral philosophy, but in the Q&A, I'm very happy to take any questions further on this. So why care about why we need to specify who should act? There's an issue in moral theory known as duty dumping. So many of you will know the theory of utilitarianism. When Peter Singer says, who is responsible for global poverty? All of us. To an extent, I think that's true. But in a way, it's also not very informative because it doesn't give a lot of scope and guidance for who should act. And so one way of phrasing this is what is everyone's responsibility becomes nobody's responsibility. And so unless there's kind of further specification, it's very easy to just assume someone else will do it. And so this is the issue of assurance. The bystander effect is very well known. If we're all standing around with all the same responsibility to do something, often we have a kind of paralysis on how to act. And so having principles to delineate our responsibilities can be very helpful. There are also questions around fairness, which I'll return to in the objections, but if we don't want sort of all the duties to fall on one particular agent or one group of agents, we may wish to distribute that somewhat. And that's where a particular theory that apportions these principles can be very helpful. And finally, it's much more effective from an even pragmatic perspective, if we care about something, to have theories of why we want, to have theories of how we should do it. If we can say who is responsible for what, the intervention and the outcome result is much more likely to be effective and efficient. So Miller's quote here, I think, captures sort of why this project is important. And so the issue is how to identify one particular agent or group of agents as having a particular responsibility to remedy the situation. For unless we can do this, there is a danger that the suffering or deprivation will continue unabated, even though everyone agrees that it is morally intolerable. And so again, the issue in much moral theory, in much global justice, isn't actually around whether what's happening is wrong, it's what we should do about it and why. Who should do something about it rather, and why. I did just want to take a slight detour, which is why care about global health? And this is two components, which is why care about health simpliciter, and why care about global rather than kind of national health reasons. Now, the first kind of reason is quite simple, which is around widespread suffering. You don't have to think that health has special moral salience to think that suffering is bad. And insofar as a lot of suffering, especially in the developing world, is traced to health insufficiencies, the action on this alone would alleviate a lot of suffering. So this is just one very pragmatic and simple reason to care about global health. But if your concern is about why care about the global rather than the sort of national health level, well, one issue is that it's what political liberals call overlapping consensus, which is just a fancy way to say that there is strong agreement that there is something really wrong about injustice in health, even beyond one's borders. We might disagree on the details of inequality, but nonetheless, serious health need, we all agree, sort of requires our attention. And so this is just a very basic overlapping consensus reasoning for why we should care. And then you might have a kind of methodological reason, which is that, the fact that we do neurosurgery doesn't mean that it's more important than cardiology. The fact that we do metaphysics doesn't mean it's more important than logic. And so you can have a moral division of labor where each of us focuses on particular reasons, particular aspects that we find interesting or are good at. And this can also be another reason why we care about global health. And this relates to Simon Caney's view that we can look at health and care about it from an integrationist perspective. So we care about health as one in a bundle of justice without saying that we just care about health. And again, that's common sense, but it's worth spelling out in those terms why we should care. And I've got forthcoming work, which I'll just flag here, around ways in which we can ground features of health and healthcare and why that gives us particular reason to care. But I'm not going to go into depth there. So all I want to show is that there's at least very strong reasons why we should theorize about global health. In fact, we have a conference. So you're probably not the type that is convincing on that. But the concept of remedial responsibility is quite slippery for a lot of people. And so the key word there is remedy rather than something else. We're looking at responsibility to rather than responsibility for. And let me give you an example, right? So often when you speak to people, people say, oh, he was responsible for breaking that window, or she was responsible for baking that cake. And it's normally backwards looking. You're trying to attribute a particular act or action to someone or something rather than something forward looking. So when you say responsibility to, it's around who has considerations of forward looking justice to do something about it. So a mother has a responsibility to feed her child. A teacher has a responsibility to look after their students. And so it's a very subtle shift of language here, but remedial responsibility is about forward-looking considerations and a kind of prospective rather than backward-looking consideration. And for those of you familiar with Iris Marion Young, the view is sort of political responsibility rather than individual or personal. And so it's not who is to blame for this particular injustice. That's a separate question of moral responsibility. Here we're worried about who has the obligation to put it right. And these, again, are evident in not only the language of how we talk about responsibility, but at least in a lot of existing concepts in not just distributive justice, but in interpersonal morality and ethics more generally. And one other way to talk about this is Taney's approach, which is when we talk about remedial responsibility, we're concerned about responsibility to stop a harm or to avoid a harm, not to share burdens of, say, who is responsible for graffitiing a wall or doing something bad in the first place. Now, this is perhaps the main sort of way that this discussion has proceeded in the literature. So imagine a scenario where there are all of us in this room and there's an injustice that requires remedy. How do you decide which of us should be the one chosen to act? And one of the 6 common ways is what's called outcome responsibility. And so to say, you know, if you're responsible for the injustice in the sense that you could have reasonably foreseen that it would happen, then you are responsible for putting it right. This is very common. It's like, you know, you broke it, so you should fix it. It's a relatively intuitive view in sort of everyday discourse. A slightly more demanding version of this is something called causal responsibility. If you're a causal factor in an injustice, then even without intention or foreseeability, you should be the one to do something about it. So even if you're not responsible for colonialism, a lot of people say that mere complicity in an action can generate duties for you to remedy something. And then there's something called moral responsibility, and this is a bit slippery. But basically it means that if there's a reason why you should be held, for example, due to a role obligation, like being a teacher or a mother, then that can be a reason for you to act. And so if a child is missing and you're the parents, there may be a sort of moral obligation, moral responsibility on the grounds of your role for you to be the one to remedy that particular situation. A more kind of communitarian view is that if you're from the same community as the victim, so say there is an outbreak of Ebola in Western Africa, then the fact that you're from that same community gives you strong reason, perhaps on this view, to be the one that remedies that injustice. More interestingly, a lot of people have talked about benefits. So people think that if you benefit from an injustice, even if you have no fault or no other relation, then you have responsibility to do something about that injustice. So there are theorists who now work, again, in the colonialist, in the anti-colonial and post-colonial literature, that the fact that you benefit from colonialism gives us moral obligations, remedial responsibility obligations to do something about redistribution or compensation. And the final of the 6 principles, which I will also argue is the most important, is capacity. So the fact that you can do something about the injustice means that you should. And so if we have, again, many of you will know Peter Singer's example of the child in the pond. If there's a child drowning, the fact that I can wade into the pond and pull the child out when all those around me cannot walk or cannot do something about it, that itself gives me a very strong reason to be the one to remedy that responsibility. Now, Miller's connection theory is roughly that who is responsible is a function of how strong these claims are. So it's a connection theory. So if I can be connected in the more of these ways, the more I can be the one who is responsible for putting something right. And he also thinks that no one principle is superior, and that every single principle is equally important and will vary depending on the context. Now, there are some inadequacies with sort of Miller's connection view and with how these principles are set up in general. The first is most theorists, as I said, focus on sort of either outcome or causal responsibility. You broke it, you fix it as a fairly intuitive view in both the law and in our everyday discourse. And speaking to most sort of lay people, this is a kind of general view. It accords with intuitions around, I guess, how we accord responsibility in the everyday sense. And as I said, most theorists follow Miller in rejecting lexical priority. That is to say, they don't think that one principle is more important than the rest, and it depends on the contextual, on the context at hand. Now, I actually think that, and this is the kind of substantive view that I'm going to put forth, is I actually think that these views are mistaken, and that capacity needs to be the primary principle for allocating remedial duties. In other words, the fact that you can do something about it is the most important view for why remedial responsibility is relevant. And hopefully I'm going to show I'm going to specify this, and then I'm going to show why this is neither entirely obvious nor entirely false. And so if I've succeeded in somewhere in the middle, then this will be relatively successful. So there are sort of several reasons why we might think that capacity should be the primary principle of responsibility. The kind of important reason to think is that it's almost conceptually demanded by the very nature of remedial responsibility. So if you define remedial responsibility as acting here and now for the sake of harm avoidance, then it's very clear that at least some level of capacity is very important. So this is the Kantian maximum of what implies can. So no matter how responsible I am for knocking over a particular vase, or no matter how responsible I am for a child who's drowning in a swimming pool, if I can't act to remedy the situation, or at least contribute towards the remedy of a situation, it's not clear that the language of remedial responsibility makes sense. And so there's what I call a very simple necessity condition, that a very, very minimal level of capacity has to be met for the language of remedial responsibility to even make sense. There's also something I call the weighting condition, which can be phrased as so, right? So an agent must be capable of remedying or contributing towards the remedy of an injustice. So that, I think, is a fairly trivial and uncontroversial claim. But again, it's something that's actually widely overlooked in this literature. But we should also continue to prioritize considerations of capacity over other principles, even amongst the pool of capable agents. And that's the weighting condition. So capacity is necessary in a very sort of minimal sense, but it also should be given additional weight over all these other principles, even once we pass that minimal threshold. And hopefully I'm going to specify this and defend why we think this should be plausible. So meeting a minimal level of capacity, which, by the way, depends on the specific injustice at hand, right? You can be capable of remedying something, but not another. So it's not as binary as that. It's got lexical priority over other considerations. But once we're above this threshold, capacity has an added weight. And the thing to make clear is that even so-called negative duties, so negative duties are duties to not do something rather than duties to do something. Even negative duties require capacity. So if I have a negative duty not to hit people, that still requires minimal capacity. So if I'm having a seizure, I'm not capable of meeting this minimal condition and this negative duty of not striking someone. And so what I want to show is just that there's a very minimal necessity condition that is overlooked. And this in itself is a very strong reason to see that we have reason to see capacity as the primary and to have lexical priority over the others. So a more formal way then, so, say we have a particular injustice that requires remedy, whether in global health or otherwise. So how do we decide which agent is responsible? Well, if capacity is the primary principle, then this gives us guidance. So which agent or combination of agents should be selected as the remedial agent is determined by the function of A, the agent's capacity for remedying or contributing towards the collective remedy of a specific injustice, and B, the seriousness and urgency of the global health justice. In the fuller sort of draft of this work, I explain the intuition we have around section B, but for now, I'll just merely assume that that has relative agreement, that there's something salient and relevant about the urgency, and that kind of is what makes this account dynamic, that it takes into account how it functions in the world as it is in the context. So an agent who does not meet the threshold in the first arm cannot be selected as a remedial agent. And the relative weight we ought to place on capacity over other remedial considerations is directly proportional to the seriousness and urgency of the global health injustice. So I think the more serious the particular emergency that we're trying to remedy, the more weight, in terms of normative weight, we should place on capacity over, say, fairness. And one way to illustrate it is a very rough diagram. So assume that you're on the maximum, on the top right corner, on a very sort of maximal case where you have an emergency that requires absolute, say it's an existential threat to humanity. And you need to decide who should act. I think it's entirely plausible in that regard to focus on finding the most effective agents and put aside who may or may not be responsible in terms of fairness for this outcome. You might think COVID is somewhere sort of heading towards the right, but perhaps not at the maximal right. And so here you might think that even though pharmaceutical companies might have concerns of fairness around intellectual property or around countries that have been more prudent, you might think that there is a kind of case why we should make these considerations secondary to harm avoidance, so considerations of effectiveness of who is the most effective agent. And on the other hand, you might think of very, very trivial cases of injustice where you think about fairness much more than effectiveness. Notice on the y-axis, fairness doesn't approach zero because the necessity condition always remains even in totally trivial injustices. And so that's a very rough way of looking at this kind of account. And it's dynamic because it's not just capacity matters all the time. I mean, it does, but the relative weight depends on the injustice in the context at hand. Now, what duties you have and what you're capable of and for is very specific. So I may be capable of performing CPR on someone who's collapsed, but not performing finger thoracostomy of someone who's coming to me with a collapsed lung. And so there are very kind of, at least, ways in which the duties that we have is captured by this account. And I'm just going to flag this up, but it's not the main focus of this talk, which is that the content of agents' remedial duties is dependent on their particular capacities and the present injustice at hand, and therefore directly linked to the issue of the selection of remedial agents. What that means basically is the definition of capacity needs necessarily to take into account what duties we need to remedy an injustice. And that's something that obviously requires empirical work and those who are working within policy to do. And almost always a division of labor is important. And so very few people are capable in toto of remedying an injustice, but as long as we're capable of remedying an injustice, then we can be selected as remedial agents. And I'm only going to flag this up, but there's also burgeoning literature on what's called prospective duties to develop capacity. So if capacity is important, we can be capable, we're not capable by ourselves, but as a group we are capable, then there's at least a prima facie obligation there to collectivize in order that we can act. So you can imagine you can't rescue a child drowning by yourself, but if somebody throws you a life ring, somebody calls the services, somebody coordinates, then that can be something that makes you as a collective capable. And in those of you who work in human rights, this is often called sort of common but differentiated duties. And so this is one way of sort of teasing out that implication. So just to briefly tie up these two processes, we have an injustice, we have an emergency, who should act? Well, firstly, we apply in the first stage all those agents who are minimally capable, either to act by themselves or to act in cohorts with other people. And so this is the kind of necessity condition of the first stage. And again, capacity is specific to the injustice. And in the second stage, we then focus on all the people we've found to be capable in that first stage. And we say that, still keeping in mind that capacity is the most important, who should we select? And again, that will depend on the seriousness of the injustice and on the strength of the other conditions. So here in the second stage, things like who is causally responsible matters, who is in the same community matters, but it's not decisive, and it's always secondary to capacity by the very nature of harm avoidance and forward-looking justice. So, there's a more detailed account for why I think this account is justified, but I just want to briefly explain why, at least there are some reasons. I'm just going to flag them, but not go into detail. So the first reason, as I've already mentioned, is the concept of remedial responsibility itself gives a strong reason for caring about capacity here and now. The second reason, which I develop in other work, is around shared vulnerabilities or inherent vulnerabilities, and from a kind of contractualist ethics perspective, can ground strong duties that I think roughly approximate the account I'm presenting. I don't defend this view here, but just to flag that this is partly where the reasons for these principles derive. And you may also think that our moral intuitions and considered judgments, even if they're not absolute or decisive, nonetheless lend credit towards this kind of view. And so those of you convinced by Singer's analogy may agree with that scenario, but disagree about his implications for global poverty. And where I want to show is, I think where Singer goes wrong is he generalizes this without further specification of kind of differential duties. But once we have a template to capture Singer's intuition, I think the intuitions we have of the case are much more plausible. Okay, in the final stage, I just want to address some objections to hopefully show why it's not as simple or as complex as it may first appear. So one view is that this account is too victim-centric. It assumes that they're helpless and that it neglects agency in the way they can help themselves. Well, the first thing to say is, the first reply is to say that, well, what happens in an emergency is very different than what happens in routine cases of day-to-day injustice or less serious instances. The duties of clinicians, I give the example here of an A&E, and the GP is very different. It's not to say that, for example, patient agency doesn't matter in any ways. I think they matter hugely. But where, for example, you may have time to talk in depth about the pros and cons and to research and to go home and think about the treatment by your GP, that time frame may not be possible in the A&E setting. And so because we're focused on the emergency situation, considerations of sort of agency may be different, at least on a kind of basic level. But the second reply is to say, well, nothing in my account precludes the victims from helping themselves. Because being incapable in one respect doesn't mean you're incapable in another. And so there's nothing wrong with saying that there are many things that I can't do, many things that you can do, and how you distribute that. It's partly a function of the sort of specific capacity. And the final third, which again relates to the sort of contractualist second person standpoint, is that all of us could be in this situation. So the fact that we are all equally vulnerable at some inherent level, not in detail, of course, to getting sick or being involved in an accident, given the nature of our bodies and the ontological composition. And I think that any of us could be in these positions, so it actually isn't victim-centric in the sense that it focuses how all of us are simultaneously capable and incapable. And so it may not undermine agency if we realize that all of us could be in this situation. A second objection is that it's too demanding morally and practically to focus on capacity. And I suspect this is why most people believe in the other principles as well. Well, the first is to sort of to bite the bullet and to say that, well, maybe morality is highly demanding. And you might think this, especially when it concerns emergencies and when the stakes of harm are very high. A second response is to sort of mitigate this response and say, well, the demandingness of the account varies depending on how serious and urgent the emergency is. And so it's incorrect to say that it's totally overly demanding. It's actually less demanding when less is at stake. And it's only very demanding at a very, very specific subset of where we are in terms of the seriousness and urgency. And the final reply to sort of mitigate this concern is to say, well, actually, we all have different duties and we can have a division of labor, we can collectivize. And this means that it's actually less demanding than having theories of universal charity or utilitarianism. And so when we have these kind of collectivization, it minimizes actually the burdens on specific individuals. Now, I think the strongest objection, or the most common objection actually, is around fairness. And this is the final objection that I want to explore today. People say it's unfair and therefore wrong for all of us to be responsible for fixing something that we are not morally or outcome responsible for. So, I didn't do that. Why should I be the one to put that right? And within sort of theories of justice, this is called the slack-taking objection. If somebody doesn't do what they're meant to do, why should I be the one to step in and do that? And I think that this is quite powerful, at least rhetorically. Well, the first is to deny the empirical premise. There are many ways in which we are responsible for the state of global health and global health injustice. And a lot of work by Thomas Pogge addresses this kind of ways in which we're complicit. But then you can also distinguish between the intervener and the payer. The fact that somebody's best placed to remedy an injustice doesn't mean that they are the ones who have to pay for it and face all the burdens. And so I can act, but then be compensated later. And this distinction comes from a lot of just war theory and around a lot of humanitarian intervention. When you say, I will intervene because I can act now and quickly, but I just demand and I deserve compensation from the person who was outcome responsible. And this is a way we can mitigate sort of fairness objections, because you're not really ultimately responsible, just taking kind of temporary responsibility now in terms of harm avoidance. There's also a kind of way in which you might think that complaints of unfairness are actually off target. So you have a complaint against a person, sort of outcome responsible for the emergency, but why should this have anything to do with the victim at hand? So consider just a stylized scenario here of three people. There's an attacker, a rescuer, and a victim. So the attacker pushes the victim into a swimming pool. The victim can't swim, but the attacker runs away. You're the rescuer B, you come across the scene. Now, if you say it's unfair for me to act, in a sense, that's true. It's unfair, but what I want to show is that if you have an interpersonal view of fairness, at least on this matter, the complaint of unfairness between the rescuer is against the attacker and not the victim. And so it's open for you here to say that actually when you say it's unfair, you say to the person it's unfair for me to rescue you, it's just a missed target response, because it's not unfair by virtue of them, it's not between you. It's unfair in virtue of your complaint against the attacker in the first place. Similarly, the victim has a complaint of fairness against the attacker, but that, again, that relationship doesn't seem to obtain between you and the victim. You may have a view of fairness where it's state of affairs rather than interpersonal, in which case the other responses will be more convincing. But a parallel way to say, when you look at welfare and distribution society, they say, why should we give free school meals? It's parents' responsibility to feed their children. On a parallel response is to say, well, that's fine, but why should the child suffer because of the parents' action? And so there, the unfairness target is missed, because it's not actually a complaint that engages with the child's interest and claim at that point in time. And the final reply is just say, well, fairness is a relevant consideration, but it doesn't necessarily trump considerations of harm avoidance, especially in emergencies. And I actually don't think it's counterintuitive to think that issues of capacity are more important than concerns about fairness in cases of emergencies. And again, that kind of way of balancing fairness and effectiveness, where effectiveness sort of means capacity, can mitigate some of those objections. So let me just try and tie this discussion together by way of conclusion. So notice that what I've tried to argue is that we all agree that something is bad, and something is wrong, and something is unjust. But the present question often is who, and specifically on what grounds, should act here and now to remedy or contribute towards a remedy of that problem. That often, at least speaking to most people, is the reason that they disagree. And they don't say, famine is not that bad. They say, yeah, it's bad, but why should I be the one to act? And so the challenge for us is to explore reasons and theories for why we should be the one to act or others should be the one to act. And I've argued that a lot of the prevailing approaches and accounts of this topic are not satisfactory. I've then shown that sort of the dynamic capacity account, where capacity has this necessity and weight and condition, is one plausible framework for allocating remedial responsibilities. And that's applied to any kind of injustice, but also in the case of global health emergencies in that regard. And basically it's dynamic because even though it focuses on capacity, it also is sensitive to other kind of factors. It knows that capacity is not universal. It can be capacity for X or capacity for Y. And being capable for one doesn't mean that you're not capable or you are capable of everything else. It's very much contextual. It's also dynamic that it acknowledges the kind of relative importance of capacity compared to other considerations of moral considerations, and that itself is sensitive to the injustice at hand. And finally, a lot of it is concerned around fairness. And so even though fairness is, I don't think, can trump always concerns of capacity, nonetheless, it can be an important way in which they can be balanced as a function of kind of how injustice and seriousness and urgency. In the Q&A, I'm very happy to take sort of other questions around how that would apply more, maybe in more concrete details to COVID or to global health emergencies. But that's just a brief overview of sort of some work in progress on this front. Thanks.